Why do I speak this language, this Anglo-Saxon language, when I am not of European descent? British blood does not flow through my veins. I am of Asian descent, Eastern heritage, but I live in the former American colonies of the Empire, the British American colonies. Some may say that the sun has set on Britain and its empire, but in many ways that's not true. But the definition of the empire has changed. If we count the nations that use the language, customs, and law of the empire, and the colony that became the legacy of Britain, the United States of America, then the empire still survives, but with a different flag, different oath, and different cause. I always thought it odd why it was called the British Empire. I always thought it was more like an English empire. England controlled everything. The Saxonites ruled the empire. All the people in the crown colonies were taught that England was the greatest country in the world, but there was no real equality in that. No, the English lied, cheated, killed, and stole to create the greatest European colonial empire in history. If London did not do it, then Paris or Barcelona or Lisbon would have done so instead. So the English were able to do what the Portuguese, Spanish, and French all did before, and they did it better. They were not the first, the Portuguese and Spanish were, but England and later America did all it could to erase the Latin legacy from the world. Before English became the most spoken European language in the world, it was French or Spanish. But England changed that. But England had its fair share of hypocrisy. A united kingdom? No. Where Wales is not even represented on the Union Jack? It's not there. Even though I have heard of some attempts to modify the flag to show a Welsh representation, but it would not look the same. The flag looks brilliant. Why change a good thing? So I suppose the Welsh can understand when no one wants to change the flag. But it may have to. Irish reunification will happen eventually, and at that time, with Ireland completely gone, the flag will have to change to show the Irish loss. Perhaps then the Welsh dragon can make an appearance. Not even that. Scotland's thinking about its own sovereignty again as well. If we look far enough into the future, the Acts of Union from 1707 won't last. Some may think never. Britain will forever remain in one shape or form. But it won't, for these acts of independence again means that sometime in the future the act will be void. These nations were independent before the Acts of Union. They will be independent and separate again sometime in the future afterward. In a modern, globalized world, where everyone is united, people want their individuality. Nations mostly. It can be said to a point that the Scottish, Irish, and Welsh might be tired of listening to all the rulers from Westminster Abbey. After all, Dublin, Edinburgh, and Cardiff exist as well. It's not just London that is important. Who has the most to lose? England, actually. With the Anglo Empire now gone, what is left? Just a few territories, but the act still remains in force, if not much longer. The legacy of the empire is America. It always was, it always is, it always will be. The greatest colony to have ever been created, the only former European colony to become a true empire itself. America's values are an echo of the British, French, and Germanic settlers who came to make up what is America. The dominant ethnic groups of America are the Europeans. The cause of the country's foundings also vary from American to British points of view. The settlers thought of themselves as British, much like those within the homeland, attuned to the same basic rights and privileges any other had in England, later Britain. But eventually the elite in Britain considered the settlers in the New World to be American rather than British. One of the key reasons why Canada was able to become a British colony was because of the American militia that fought against the French in the name of Britain. Even though the British later dominated the entire North American continent, they knew that the American colonies were extremely important. Boundless American resources were used to fuel Britain's early empire. The 13 colonies were also the most populous. because of good living conditions rather than the harsh Canadian North. After America declared its independence, the view was from the American side was that the empire had been broken. This was the first time that a European colony had broken away from the empire of its creation. To many degrees, this was the only successful colonial war of independence. The Spanish, French, and Portuguese colonies later declared independence as well, but none experienced the stability and growth that America had. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were also quote-unquote given independence, but later fell within America's shadow. Why was America so successful? I believe one factor was timing and circumstance. With America dealing with a sparsely populated Quebec to the north and Louisiana to the west, there was no real threat to America in the short term. But the first Americans knew that with two empires surrounding them, they had to become a stable nation. Another factor was trade. Ironically, Britain turned out to be a good trading partner with America to a point, but relations with Britain would not really be back to a decent level for over 100 years after independence. It was also the lure of America, the land of the free, by the people, for the people, and to the people that appealed to so many all over the world, or at that time from Europe. But with America gone, how would Britain rebuild its empire? London had to essentially take what was left in the world by that time. With America gone, Britain had to re-establish its hold on world influence by taking new territories. Australia had been known to London, but it was not exactly the best pick. Why colonize Australia when America was naturally the better choice? Even though settlements had started before the American War of Independence, it can be said that the colonization started in part because America had broken away from the empire. In many ways, Australia is more similar to America than any other colonial nation, even more so than Canada. America was founded to be a religious paradise. Australia was founded as a prison colony. After America declared its independence, convicts based for the colony of Georgia were then sent to Australia instead. The British, by this point, knew how to deal with native peoples, after having gained experience from dealing with the natives in both America and Canada. The forced integration of the Aborigines is actually something that's very commonly known in Australia. Such things actually happen within America and Canada as well, but only in Australia did it happen in the late colonial era and was documented in photography and, to a point, film. And the British were rather harsh to their cousins who later called themselves Australian. One reason was that the lower levels of British society were the majority of the original Australian European settlers. While the higher caste remained back within Britain itself, the lack of compassion and rights was something that the Americans could easily identify with the Australians. Seeing as that was a major factor in declaring independence, with all that the Australians had to deal with at times, I do believe that they would have declared independence, but they had nothing. America had another colonial empire to help, which was France. America had resources to fuel a prolonged war. Australia did not. When America declared its independence, this was the right time in history, arguably. Even if the Australians wanted to, the time was no longer right to do so. Ironically, Americans can be envious of Australians as well. Australia did something publicly that Americans can only do privately: restrict which peoples can enter the country according to racial origin, the White Australia policy. The American Constitution means that any person, regardless of race, country of origin, religious, or political ideology, can enter the country. Australia said no to all of this, and this caught the attention of many. Not for good reasons, naturally, but the Australian government were honest with what their thoughts were, and the people within Australia were as well. America has to essentially accept the rubbish of the world with a gritted smile. People taking advantage of our Constitution as a result. But Australia still has nothing. It's a desert island. Yes, I believe that Australia is not exactly a continent, but rather the world's largest island. Australia is actually a dangerous place to live in. Most of the world's poisonous animals reside there. Water can be scarce at times, and the landmass isn't really developed. Most people live along the coast because the interior is not exactly habitable for large populations of human beings. But even with all of this, from the colonial legacy that was America to the prison colony Australia, both the original settlers of these regions had thoughts of independence. America actually did it. Australia could not. New Zealand is a case that shall be forever linked with Australia. Originally an extension of Australia, New Zealand is one where it is viewed as the most distant of all the British colonies. An exotic land even by British colonial standards, there was even a motion to combine the colonial governments of Australia and New Zealand into a single nation, but this idea was rejected. But there was one region that was always loyal to Britain, so much so that its very identity depends on it. Canada, the topic of more than a few narrations of mine. Be sure to listen and watch these videos as well if you would want to hear an absolute in-depth description of the Canadian view. I would argue that Canada views itself as the most loyal region of the empire, besides those in Britain itself. The original region of Canada to be settled by the Loyalist refugees after the American War of Independence, Ontario is still a stronghold of Canadian identity, and even pro-British to a point, depending on who you ask and where you ask it. The idea of truly freeing Canada from the British yoke is something of extreme debate within Canada. Changing the Canadian red ensign to the current maple leaf nearly did not happen due to pro-British sentiment, but Canada is currently at a crossroads. The country will never have the gigantic immigrant community that America has, but newer generations of Canadians are questioning the loyalist sentiment that has defined that country since its inception. There has been talk about abolishing the monarchy, as young Canadians think it's a relic of colonialism. True, it would mark a step forward for Canada, but with that single view gone, Canada is essentially another version of America, albeit less powerful but slightly larger in terms of territory. The idea of Canada is extremely controversial in Quebec, which I personally have never thought of as Canadian. There has also been another narration on this topic, be sure to listen to that as well. The empire no longer exists. It has gone into the records of history, as all empires before it. But England's empire was the most successful of all the colonial spheres of influence. Why? Here is the reason. In the modern era, only the British colonies of America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are stable nations. The Spanish, French, and Portuguese colonies are still unstable nations whom constantly argue among each other for useless reasons. Blood is still being shed in every Latin American nation, every former French African colony, and Brazil is only now starting to stabilize in the 21st century. My own personal view as to why the former colonies are quote-unquote stable is because when America declared its independence, it was at a point in Western history where a nation could develop and be at relative peace. The exact success of the American War of Independence was also extraordinary. The Declaration of Independence was the only successful colonial war of independence as mentioned before. Every other notion of independence by every other colonial nation has failed, or the country that declared independence balkanized due to internal corruption or external factors. London kept the empire under strict control, if one must be blunt. This control lasted into the 20th century, and this control was kept in the settler colonies. In the other regions of Britain's grasp, like India, Asia, and Africa, these regions fell into chaos because the animosity that existed before Britain seized control. Hong Kong and Singapore seem to be the only Asian territories that have retained their Western drive. But Singapore has to deal with the at times unstable Indonesia, and Hong Kong has to deal with a Chinese mainland government that is still communist at this time. The final factor worth mentioning is America. How could a former European colony become so powerful, even surpassing its former colonial creator in terms of power, prestige, and personification? The Americans had to do everything on their own, so they simply decided to do it better. This is an idea worth mentioning because why are the other former British settler colonies not as powerful, or as influential, or respected as America? Technically, Canada is larger of a country than America, but it's a nation often at America's mercy and indirect subjugation. Britain itself was weakened by two world wars and the idea of modern democracy that originated in America. War and the voice of the people is what gave America power. Liberty is what caused Britain's downfall. Originally, there was no real freedom within England or later Britain. It was the oath to the king and country, to the sovereign. America was the first nation in modern times to proclaim a nation for the people and by the people. As long as Britain and America exist in any form, the ideas that these nations devised shall forever remain and shall forever reinforce the fact that the British Empire and the United States of America remain unchallenged.